At 21, with everything she owned zipped into one canvas duffel and a dead man's tool roll under her arm. Sadie Byrne stood on a courthouse floor with $83 to her name and no bed to go home to. The man who had raised her for the last 6 years had been dead 9 days. And when the county put the boarded-up Victorian at the top of Larkin's Hill on the auction block, the house that had stood empty for 9 years, the one children dared each other to touch, the one everybody swore had a ghost. She lifted her hand and bought it for $18. The room laughed at her. They called it the money pit on Pruitt Hill. They called it the witch house, the red lighthouse, the place with the dead woman in the tower. A man near the front said loud enough to carry that she'd just paid $18 for the privilege of being haunted, and half the folding chairs laughed with him. But Sadie had been taught, by a man with sawdust in his eyebrows and patience in his hands, that nothing is ruined just because it's been left in the dark. It's only ruined when the last person who could see it stops looking. So she paid in 1s and a 5, took a brass key, gone black with age, and walked up a hill the whole town had spent 9 years pretending wasn't there. That was later. First there was the lawyer's office, and the smell of old carpet, and the man behind the desk who couldn't quite meet her eyes. The office had a clock on the wall that ran 3 minutes slow. And Sadie had checked it against the courthouse bell on her way in, because small habits like that were what kept her hands from shaking. The lawyer had a thin folder open in front of him and a way of tapping his pen that told her he had somewhere better to be. Otis Vandermeer left no will, he told her, because Otis Vandermeer left almost nothing to will. The shop was rented. The equipment was leased against a loan he'd never finished paying. The bank would take the building back by the end of the month. You were his apprentice, the lawyer said, like it was a question he already knew the answer to. 6 years, Sadie said. He turned a page. There's no legal relationship here, you understand. No adoption, no guardianship after you turned 18. He wasn't your father. He was, Sadie said, but she didn't argue it because arguing with a folder had never once moved a single line inside it, and she'd learned that a long time ago. She signed where his pen pointed. She took the one thing the estate let her take, which was hers anyway, the long canvas roll she'd carried into that office and would carry out of it. And she walked out into a gray November morning with $83 folded into her sock and no idea where she'd sleep when the cold came all the way down. She was good at exactly one thing, 2 if you counted the second as separate, and both of them lived in that canvas roll. She'd come to Otis at 15, a foster placement nobody expected to hold, dumped in a limestone town in southern Indiana with a caseworker who was already looking at her watch. Otis was a widower in his 70s who fixed the things nobody else in 3 counties would touch. Church windows, mostly. Stained glass. He'd climb a scaffold at 74 to re-lead a cracked saint, and he did it slow and he did it right. And the first week she lived in the rooms above his shop, he barely said 40 words to her. Then one Saturday he set a shattered panel on the workbench in front of her. A lily done in a dozen shades of white that had come out of a demolished chapel in a garbage bag, and he asked her what was wrong with it. Everything, she said. Half the glass was gone, the lead was oxidized to powder, 3 pieces had been ground to gravel. Otis almost smiled. Nothing's wrong with it, he said, that patience can't fix. He handed her a lead knife. A thing isn't broken because it's been dropped. It's broken when nobody's willing to build it back. For 6 years she built things back. She learned to cut glass so it broke where she wanted and nowhere else, to grind an edge without chipping it, to read the old lead lines a 100-year-old craftsman had drawn and lay her hand right into his. And the back room, the one with the light-tight door and the red bulb, that was where Otis taught her the second thing. Because before the church window work dried up, Otis had made his living another way, developing and printing photographs and repairing the cameras of a town that couldn't afford new ones. He taught her the chemistry of it. He taught her to bring a face up out of nothing in a tray of developer, the way a face rises up out of deep water. He taught her that glass and silver and light were all the same trade, really. You held still, you kept the room dark, and you waited for the picture to decide it was ready to be seen. Then one morning he didn't come down to open the shop, and it was his heart, and a different woman with a different folder was already talking about where the equipment would go, before the funeral home had even sent a car. Nobody asked Sadie what she wanted. She kept the tool roll and the developing tank and a lens or two, because those were the tools of the two things she knew how to do, and everything else in the world had already been decided for her by someone with a pen. She knew how to fix things. She just had nothing left to fix, and nowhere to do it. The library was warm and free. So that was where she spent the first 3 days, reading job listings she had no address to answer. And on the corkboard by the returns desk, a 12 Lustog flyer and a notice about the harvest supper at the Methodist Church, someone had pinned a single county sheet. Public auction. Tax delinquent properties. Courthouse Annex, Thursday 10 in the morning. A column of parcel numbers ran down the page in tiny print. She wasn't sure why she went. Maybe because the annex was warm too. Maybe because a person who owns nothing likes to sit in a room where things hands, on the chance that one of them might change toward her. The annex smelled of wet wool and scorched coffee. 20-odd people sat on folding chairs. Most of them men with the settled boredom of regulars, a few with phones and notebooks, and one man in a coat that cost more than everything Sadie had ever owned, sitting near the front with the easy stillness of someone who'd already decided what he was leaving with. The auctioneer worked through the lots in a flat, fast voice, a flooded double-wide, a weed lot behind the feed store, a storefront that had failed as 3 different diners. Then he came to parcel 41 on the sheet, and he paused, and the pause was what made her look up. "The Pruitt place," he said. "Some of you know it." A few people laughed low, a sound the room had clearly made before. "Top of Pruitt Hill," he went on. 2 stories and a turret, sits on a double lot, condition listed as poor, back taxes going on 9 years. Sold as is, where is. County takes no responsibility, and if you ask me, county's glad to be rid of it. That got a bigger laugh. A woman 2 chairs over leaned to her neighbor and said her boys wouldn't walk past it after dark. That you could still see the red lights some nights, and the neighbor said she'd seen it herself in '91 and never gone up that hill since. "We'll open," the auctioneer said, like he expected to take it right back at $18. Sadie did the arithmetic before she decided to. $18 left her 65, a double lot, 2 stories of walls and a roof that had kept 9 years of weather off whatever was inside. She thought about the shelter bed 40 miles away in the county seat that she'd have to give up every morning whether or not anything came along to replace it. She thought about Otis, on the scaffold, 74 years old, saying that a thing isn't broken because it's been dropped. Her arm went up. It went up slow and steady, the same motion she used to lift a hot iron off a lead seam so it wouldn't pull the joint. For a second nobody saw it. Then the auctioneer did, and his face did a small, complicated thing. 18, he said. "I've got 18 from the young lady in back. Do I hear 20? Nobody breathed to make it 20. The man in the good coat turned all the way around in his chair to look at her, and it wasn't pity on his face. It was closer to irritation, like she'd reached past him for the last seat on a bus he'd been about to board. A man in a feed cap said let her have it, she can charge folks to see the witch, going twice. Sadie kept her arm where it was, and her eyes on the front of the room, calm and unhurried, the way Otis stood when a church committee questioned his price. The gavel came down. "Sold?" the auctioneer said, and shook his head as he wrote it. "The Pruitt house to the young lady in back for $18. She paid at the clerk's window, 1s and a 5, and the clerk slid her a single sheet of paper and a key on a loop of dirty string, the brass so dark it looked burnt. He held the key half a second longer than he needed to. "You know about that place," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know it's mine now," Sadie said, and folded the deed into her jacket next to the little cash she had left, and walked out before he could decide to warn her about anything. Pruitt Hill climbed the east edge of Larkin, past houses that got smaller and more tired the higher the street went, until the pavement gave out into cracked concrete, and the limestone showed through the grass like bone through skin. At the top, where the street ran out against the hill, the house stood alone, on a double lot behind a fence that had surrendered years ago. 2 kids on bikes had trailed her the last block, hanging back, daring each other closer. When she turned up the front walk, one of them braked so hard his back tire slid. "You're not going in there," the boy said. "It's mine," Sadie told him. "I live here now." The girl shook her head, almost gently, like she was correcting an adult who'd gotten a simple fact wrong. "Nobody lives there. There's a light. It comes on red in the top window, and there's nobody to turn it on, so it's her." She glows red because of how she died." The boy nodded, like this was settled science. Then they stood on their pedals and shoved off down the hill, and one of them yelled something over his shoulder that the wind took before it reached her. She stopped at the broken gate and looked at the house, and for a moment she understood why the town told stories. It was a tall, narrow Victorian, 3 stories of it climbing into a low gray sky, with a round turret bulging off one corner, and a single tall window at the top of the turret that had been painted over on the inside, flat and black, so it stared down at the street like a closed eye. The paint on the clapboards had weathered to the color of an old bruise. Most of the windows were boarded. A wild grapevine had climbed the whole north face and pulled a length of gutter loose. Everyone who looked at this house saw a haunted house. Sadie made herself look at it the way Otis would have. She saw a roof. She saw good square bones. She saw stained glass transoms over the boarded windows, dirty but whole, and even from the gate she could tell the leading was original. She saw, high up, that blacked-out turret window, and something about it snagged in her mind and wouldn't let go. Because Sadie had spent 6 years of her life in a room with a window painted exactly that black, for exactly one reason. But she didn't have the thought all the way yet. She only stood there a moment longer, and then she went up a front walk cracked by 9 winters of frost, and the porch held her weight, barely, and the black key fought the lock and then gave. The door swung inward on a long groan into a hall full of gray light, and the smell came out to meet her. Dust and cold ash and mouse, and under all of it something faint and sharp and unmistakable that stopped her on the threshold with one boot still on the porch. Vinegar, and under the vinegar very old, a whiff like struck matches and rotten eggs. Anybody else would have called it a dead house, smelling of a dead house. Sadie knew that smell the way she knew her own hands. It was the ghost of photographic fixer, of stop bath and hypo, the smell that had lived in the back room of Otis's shop and in the creases of her own knuckles for 6 years. Somebody had developed photographs in this house. A great many of them, for a very long time. She stood in the doorway of the first thing she had ever owned, and she said hello into the dark and felt foolish, and said it anyway. Nothing answered, but somewhere deeper in the house, soft on bare boards, something moved. The hall opened into rooms gone to ruin in the patient way empty houses go. Plaster down in sheets. A staircase curving up into shadow with a banister she could tell at one touch was solid oak under the grime. She moved through slow, cataloging damage and worth at the same time, the habit so deep she didn't notice she was doing it. The floors were wide plank and sound. The parlor had a bay of stained glass, an amber and green border around a center of old wavy glass, filthy but unbroken, and she stopped in front of it and cleaned one pane with her sleeve just to watch the afternoon come through it gold. Whoever built this house had built it to outlast them all. It was the front room off the hall that made her stop, because the front room didn't make sense for a house. It had been a studio. She knew it the moment she stepped in, the way you know a kitchen. There was a raised platform at one end, and a rail on the ceiling where a backdrop had once hung, and a tall north-facing window, the only window in the house that hadn't been boarded, because north light is the one thing a person who makes pictures will never board over. Against the far wall stood a wooden camera the size of a small dog, an 8x10 view camera on a stand, its bellows collapsed and cracked, but its vren still in place, and beside it a stack of film holders furred gray with dust. Sadie set down her duffel and her tool roll and stood very still in the middle of the room. And for the first time since the gate she felt the fine hair rise on her arms. Not because the house was frightening, because it wasn't frightening at all. It felt, under the ruin, like a place that had been full of work and full of people, and she could not for the life of her work out who they had been, or where they had gone, or why a house that had so clearly been a place of making had been left to rot at the top of a hill, while the town below crossed the street to keep out from under its shadow. She was still standing there when the thing that had moved came down to find her. It was not a ghost. It was a young man, tall and thin, and stooped like he was apologizing for his own height, standing in the hall doorway with a hatchet held low at his side, not raised, just held, the way you hold a thing you've forgotten you're holding. He couldn't have been more than 19. His clothes were clean but too big and too thin for the weather, and his eyes were the wariest thing she had ever seen on a human face, and she had seen a great many wary faces, most of them in mirrors. They looked at each other for a long moment. Sadie made no sudden move. She'd learned young that the surest way to frighten a frightened thing is to show it you're frightened too. "I bought the house," she said, keeping her voice as level as the north light. "This morning, $18 at the county. I'm not calling anybody." She nodded at the hatchet. "You can put that down or keep it, either way's fine by me." He didn't put it down, but his grip changed, went loose, and after a moment he said, in a voice gone rusty from disuse, that he'd been keeping the water out of the back bedroom with a tarp. That there was a bad place in the roof, and he'd been up on the ladder in it in September. That he wasn't stealing anything. There was nothing to steal. He'd just been keeping the rain off the boxes in the tower. Because she'd told him to. Sadie's careful calm slipped one notch. "Who told you to?" she asked. And the young man looked at the floor and said, "The lady." And Sadie said, "What lady?" And he said, "The one who used to live here." And Sadie said, "When did she tell you that?" And the young man was quiet a long moment and then said, "A while ago, before she died, and I never stopped, because somebody has to keep the rain off. That was the deal." His name was Cyrus. That was all he'd give her that first night, a first name, said grudgingly, like it cost him something. She learned the rest in pieces over the days that followed, the way you learn anything from a person who's been taught that talking is dangerous. He was 19. He'd been sleeping in the carriage house at the back of the lot, on and off for 2 years, since he'd left off a home that wasn't safe and found nowhere in Larkin that would take a boy with no money and a record of running. He kept the roof tarped and the animals out, and told himself he was keeping a promise, though the woman who'd made him promise had been dead longer than he'd known her. Sadie didn't ask him the questions a worse person would have asked. She just told him the same thing she'd once been told, the only deal she'd ever known how to offer anybody. You stay, you eat. There's not much, but what there is there's half of for you. Cyrus looked at her like he was waiting for the catch, because there is always a catch when you've lived a life that puts a 19-year-old in a cold couch house. She let him wait. Some things a person has to find out, by living through enough nights to believe them. The next morning she went down the hill to spend some of her $65, because before she could chase whatever the house was hiding, she had to make it a place a person could survive the winter in. Otis's list, always the same. Stop the water first, then a door that locks, then light, then heat. Everything after that was finish work, and finish work she could do in her sleep. The town below had been built for more people than it had now, wide limestone-fronted streets half gone dark. She passed a diner with steamed windows, and her stomach said something about it. And she kept walking until she found a low storefront on a side street with a hand-painted sign that read Prosser, Fryman Camera, and under it, smaller, Poto Supplies. Repairs. We still do film. A bell over the door announced her. Inside it smelled of cut mat board and old fixer, a smell that put a hook straight through her chest, and a woman behind the counter looked up from a ledger. She was somewhere in her 60s, broad and square with reading glasses pushed up into iron gray hair and hands that had cut 1,000 miles of matboard. "Help you find something," the woman said. "I need chemistry," Sadie said before she'd meant to. And then she caught herself and said what she'd come to say. "A tarp big enough for a roof patch, roofing cement, a hasp and a padlock, and lamp oil if you carry it." The woman took her glasses off. "That's a specific list for a face I've never seen. You working a job?" "My own place," Sadie said. "I'm fixing it up." "Where at?" Sadie had learned that the truth cost less than a lie in the long run, so she paid it. "Top of the hill. The Pruitt house. I bought it Thursday at the county for $18. The shop went quiet in a particular way, and the woman looked at her over the counter for a long moment. Then she came around it. "You bought the Pruitt place," she said, and it wasn't a laugh. It was something older and heavier than a laugh. "Lord, somebody finally did." She put out a square ink-stained hand. "Opal," she said. "Opal Prosser." And Sadie shook it and said her own name, and Opal held on a beat longer than a handshake needed and looked at her the way you'd look at a piece of glass to see if it was cracked all the way through. Then she loaded the cart herself, and Sadie noticed that the prices Opal wrote in her book were not the prices on the tags. The tarp became a remnant. The lamp oil became a sample. When Sadie started to argue, Opal waved her off with the flat of her hand. "You're putting a roof back on the Pruitt house," she said. "Far as I'm concerned, that makes you a customer for life. And you can owe me till you're old." They carried it out to Sadie's arms in the doorway, and Sadie said, because she had to ask somebody, "What's the story on it?" "Everybody acts like I bought a grave." And Opal leaned against the doorframe and folded her arms and looked up the hill. Though you couldn't see the house from there. "Depends who you ask," she said. "Ask the county, it's a write-off they couldn't give away. Ask those kids on bikes, it's haunted. There's a dead woman in the tower who glows red." She paused. "Ask me, and I'll tell you the truth, which is that Alma Pruitt lived in that house 60-some years, and for 44 of them she did the kindest work this town ever saw, and Larkin decided that was the strangest thing it had ever heard of, and called her a witch for it." "Alma Pruitt," Sadie said. "That's whose key I've got. That's whose house it was, near enough. She took it on young, and she died 9 years back come spring." Opal's eyes had gone somewhere else. "Folks saw that red light in her turret window her last 20 years, and decided she was a ghost before she was even gone. Easier than climbing the hill to ask after an old woman. Easier than admitting what they'd let her carry up there alone." "What did she do up there?" Sadie asked. "All those years." Opal was quiet a moment. "That," she said, "is a longer story than your roof can wait for. You get the rain stopped, then you come back and I'll feed you and tell you some of it." She pressed the lamp oil into Sadie's hands. "Go on, lights burning." Before Sadie could go, Opal disappeared into the back and came out with a paper sack, warm, that turned out to hold a ham sandwich and 2 hard-boiled eggs. She didn't make anything of it. She just put it on top of the tarp and said, "Eat while you work, you're all wrists." And Sadie climbed the hill with more than she'd come down with, and a tightness in her throat she had no name for, and didn't try to give one. She patched the roof that afternoon, and Cyrus held the ladder without being asked, and passed her the trowel when her hand came down for it, before she'd said a word, because he'd done this patch himself in September and knew the drill. It was cold, ugly work, balanced on the steep slate with the tarp snapping in the wind. But when they came down, the ragged coin of gray sky over the back bedroom was gone, and the house was, for the first time in 9 years, dry. Sadie stood in the weeds of the yard and looked up at the two of them, her hands and Cyrus's hands, and felt the clean, specific satisfaction of a thing that had been broken, and now in one place was not. The next day she went at the house one bite at a time, the only honest way to face down an impossible job. She hung the front door back, true, so it latched and locked. She washed 6 years of grime off the parlor stained glass and got the north studio window clean enough to work by. She and Cyrus wrestled a rusted potbelly stove upright and got a fire in it, and the front room threw real heat for the first time in 9 years, and the boy stood in front of it, with his eyes closed like a man come in out of the sea. She caught him, the second night, asleep on the floor near the stove, with the ham sanch sack folded flat, and saved in his pocket like it was something he might need proof of later. She didn't wake him. She put her own jacket over him and let him have the warm. But the whole time she worked, the north studio and its dead camera and that painted black tower window worked on her. Because the house told a story she was uniquely able to read. Anyone else would have seen an old lady's junk. Sadie saw a working studio. She saw the platform where a subject would sit. She saw, when she pulled the film holders down and blew the dust off them, that they were the real thing, 8x10 sheet film holders and older glass plate holders. Dozens of them, and every one of them empty, unloaded, as if whoever used them had loaded the last plate and never come back to load another. She saw hooks on the studio wall where a backdrop and a headrest had hung. And she saw, running her hand along the hallway, upstairs on the 4th evening, that the second floor made no more sense than the studio had. Because the upstairs hall ended too soon, she was sure of it. From the street, from the yard, the turret climbed the whole east corner of the house, 3 stories of it, with that black window at the very top. But from inside, the second floor hall stopped at a blank wall a good 15 feet short of where the turret had to be, papered over in a faded pattern of climbing ivy that was newer and tighter than the ruined paper everywhere else. Sadie stood in front of that wall, with the lantern in her hand, and felt the whole shape of the house rearrange in her head. There was a room behind it, a round room up in the tower, with a window painted black on the inside so that no light could get in or out. And Sadie Byrne, who had spent 6 years of her life in exactly such a room, knew precisely what a person builds a light-tight sealed chamber for. She'd smelled the answer the moment she'd opened the front door. She could have opened that wall that night. She stood there with the pry bar already in her hand and made herself put it down, because the light was going, and Otis's first rule had always been that you don't take a thing apart in the dark. Whatever was sealed behind the ivy had waited longer than she'd been alive. It could wait one more night, until she could see what her hands were doing. She went down to the warm front room, and Cyrus was awake, sitting cross-legged by the stove, and she asked him the question she'd been holding. "Did you ever go in the tower room? The one that's sealed up?" And Cyrus shook his head slow. "She kept it shut," he said. "Alma. She said there was nothing up there worth getting into, that it was just old boxes, and I should keep the rain off the roof over it and leave the wall be. So I did." He looked at the fire. "But some nights before she got too sick to climb, I'd see the light on in the top window from out in the carriage house. Red. And I never once believed there was nothing up there." He looked at Sadie. "I think she told me it was nothing so I wouldn't have to keep the secret. So it'd be hers and not mine." Sadie thought about that a long time after the boy had slept. A woman who sealed a room and painted a window black and told a frightened kid there was nothing inside, not to hide something shameful but to spare him the weight of it. She lay on the floor of a house she owned, with her tool roll under her hand where she could reach it, and the boy breathing slow across the room, and the whole spread out below the hill in its small scattered lights. And she thought, whatever's up there, it's mine now. And the weight of it, whatever it turns out to weigh, is going to be mine too. Before we go any further up that hill, I want to ask you something. If a story about the people this world forgets means anything to you, take 1 second and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It costs you nothing, and it keeps the light on for the next person who needs a story like this one. Now let's find out what Alma Pruitt sealed behind that wall. She opened it at first light. She peeled the ivy paper back in one long strip, and under it was not plaster. Under it were boards, wide pine boards nailed flat across a doorframe, and around the edges of them she could see now the casing of a real door that someone had covered on purpose. She fit the claw of the pry bar under the first board and set her weight against it, and it came loose with a shriek of old nails that rang down the empty hall. Cyrus came up the stairs at the sound, and then just stood and watched, not helping, not stopping her, his face doing something complicated. The second board came easier. By the fourth she could see the door behind them. A plain paneled door with a porcelain knob gone yellow, and no lock, just a knob, and hinges that someone had oiled before they sealed it away, so that when she wrapped her cold hand around the knob and turned it, the door swung inward without a sound. The smell came out first. Stronger here, concentrated, 40 years of fixer and developer soaked into the wood, sharp enough to sting. Sadie lifted the lantern through the doorway, and the light reached into the dark and found the first thing, and she forgot how to breathe. It found the safe light, a red bulb in a black metal hood hanging over a long wooden bench, dead and cold now, but unmistakable, the red light the whole town had spent 40 years being afraid of. Under it ran a counter with 3 enamel developing trays still sitting in a row, dry and stained rust and silver, and a print washer and an enlarger, a tall old cast iron enlarger bolted to the bench, its lens pointed down at nothing. This was the red glow in the window. This was the ghost. It had never been a ghost. It had been a woman working late in a room where the only light you can safely burn is a dim red one. In a house at the top of a hill, printing photographs by hand, one at a time, deep into the night, for reasons Sadie did not understand yet but could already feel the shape of. She stepped through the doorway and lifted the lantern higher, and the room came up out of the dark around her. It was the missing end of the house, the round turret room, wide and low under the slope of the roof, and at the far end bulged the curved wall of the tower with its single tall window, painted flat black on the inside with careful deliberate strokes, so that not one thread of red light would ever leak out to a town that would not have understood it. Somebody had not wanted to be seen up here. Somebody had sat up here anyway, night after night, year after year, in the dark with the red light and the trays, and had painted the window black so the town could keep its ghost and she could keep her work. The walls were shelves, floor to ceiling on both curving sides, and the shelves were full of boxes. Flat archival boxes, the kind that hold prints, and smaller ones and rows of what Sadie knew at a glance, because she'd handled them in Otis Yass's shop, glass photographic plates standing on edge in wooden racks like records in a shop. Hundreds of them. Thousands maybe. Each rack labeled on the end in the Glunzverkehrfilm she'd half recognized on the burnt brass key tag. She lifted the lantern to the nearest rack and read the labels. A year, another year. The years ran back and back. The earliest rack she could find, low in a corner, was labeled 1949. 44 years of them, if the last plates dated to the 90s when the red light finally went out. 44 years of somebody standing in this dark round room, bringing faces up out of trays of silver. She set the lantern on the writing desk under the black window, the desk where an old woman had sat, and she opened the first flat box her hand touched. Inside were prints, 8 by 10, mounted on gray board, and the top one was a portrait of a child. A boy, maybe 6, in a bed, propped on pillows, in a nightgown thin as a bird, his eyes enormous in a face gone sharp with sickness. And whoever had made the picture had made it with such tenderness that the boy did not look sick. He looked seen. He looked like the most important person in the world for the 1/30th of a second the shutter was open. And someone had spent real skill and real love making sure of it. Sadie turned it over. On the back in pencil, in that same careful hand, was a name, a date in the winter of 1961, and one line. Made 3. Gave his mother 2. He went home to God the following Tuesday. She kept the 1. Sadie's hands had gone slow and careful without her telling them to. The careful of handling a thing that had cost somebody everything. She did not understand all of it yet, but she was beginning to. On the desk, apart from the boxes, sat a book. Thick, bound in cracked black leather, the kind a shop would sell as a ledger, and it was the only object in that room without a skin of dust on it, because the dust on it had been wiped away by a hand more than once, the gloss of a thing that gets touched. Sadie sat down in the chair where an old woman had sat in the dark for 44 years, and she opened the book to the first page. At the top, in ink gone brown with age, it said, "The Scene," and under that a single line underlined once. "No one goes unseen. Not if I can not on this hill." Then the entries began. They were short. A date, a name, sometimes a full name, sometimes only a first name, and a question mark where a family name should have been. A word or two about who they were. And then always the accounting, not of money, but of prints. How many she made. How many she gave. Whether she kept one. Sadie read down the first page, and the second, and the 10th, and the room got very quiet around her. The names were the names Larkin had never wanted. The limestone workers, mostly, the men who cut the stone that built half the courthouses in the Midwest and lived and died in shacks along the quarry road. Immigrants, a lot of them, Hungarians and Italians, whose own families back across the water had never once seen their faces after they left. Alma had photographed them. Everyone who'd come up the hill in the dark, and their wives, and their children. And she'd given them the only photograph they would ever own, the one image to send home across an ocean that said, "Here I am still alive. This is the face of the man you married." There were the children from the county poor farm out past the river, photographed one by one so that a child nobody claimed would at least exist somewhere on paper. There were the patients from the tuberculosis sanatorium up the valley, come down to the hill on their good days, wanting one dignified picture before the disease took the rest. There were the old and the alone and the ones the churches wouldn't seat in front, page after page, decade on decade, in the same hand getting shakier as the years climbed. Sadie read until the lantern guttered, and she had to trim it, and then she read more. Some entries were 3 lines. Some held a whole life in a single sentence. A girl who came the night before she was to be sent away, wanting one photograph of herself as she was, before she became whatever they were going to make her. A pair of quarry brothers, both killed the same year in the same collapse, photographed together the summer before, laughing, and Alma had written under it, the only picture their mother had of them both alive, and she keeps it in her Bible. I have seen it there. And one entry, near the middle of the book, under a woman's name, said only, "She came so her children would have a face to remember her by. She was gone by autumn. I hope they have it still." Sadie read that one, and had to set the book down and press the heels of her hands against her eyes until the burning behind them stopped. The house had not been haunted. The house had been the one place in Larkin where the forgotten could go to be looked at. Really looked at. By someone who thought they were worth the silver and the time. for 44 years, run by one woman who never told the town what she was doing, because the town would have found a way to make it small, or shameful, or against some ordinance, and she knew it. Alma Pruitt had spent her whole life making sure the people this town threw away had at least one proof that they had been here. And when she got too old to climb the stairs to the tower, she had not put a plaque on the door or told a reporter. She had painted the window black, sealed the room, told a frightened boy there was nothing inside, and sat with all of it in the dark until she died. And then the house had waited 9 years for someone who could read what was in it. That was the thing Sadie understood last, sitting in the dark chair with the ledger in her lap, and it landed on her like a hand on the shoulder. She was the only person in the world who could have opened this room and known what it was. A carpenter would have seen boxes of old glass. A developer would have gotten it. But the town had exactly one developer left, and Otis was dead, and he had spent 6 years teaching his chemistry to a foster girl nobody expected Ed to hold, and that girl had walked into a county auction with $65 because the annex was warm, and raised her hand at an $18 house. She thought about Cyrus, downstairs, keeping the rain off the roof over this exact room for 2 years because a dead woman had asked him to. She thought about how a house finds the people it needs, and how that isn't magic, it's just that the people a thing needs are the people who can see it. And most people had spent 44 years refusing to look up the hill. She did not sleep. She read the ledger front to back, and then she went down to the studio and did the one thing only she could do. Because in the film holders she'd dusted off, in the rack marked with the last year the light burned, she'd found 4 glass plates still loaded, exposed, and never developed. Alma had made 4 last portraits and died before she could bring them into the light. Sadie mixed developer from the chemistry Opal had let her have. In trays she washed out in the frozen kitchen, and she carried the plates up to the tower and worked them in the dark. By the light of a red bulb she wired to the old safe light hood, and one by one, 4 faces rose up out of the tray the way a face rises up out of deep water. An old man, a young mother with a baby. 2 children, a boy and a girl, holding hands, strangers to Sadie. But somebody's, every one of them. Somebody had climbed this hill wanting to be remembered, and had trusted an old woman to make it so, and the old woman had died before she could keep the promise, and now, 9 years later, a 21-year-old with a dead man's tools kept it for her. Sadie hung the 4 wet prints on a line across the tower window, over the black paint, and stood in the red light and looked at 4 people who had waited 9 years to be seen. And she said the line from the front of the ledger out loud, to the room, to Alma, to herself. No one goes unseen. In the morning she went down the hill to find Opal, because she had to tell somebody or she'd come apart, and Opal took one look at her face across the shop and set down the mat knife she was holding. "You found it," Opal said. "Whatever it is, you found it." And Sadie told her, in the back of the frame shop, over coffee in a chipped mug, and Opal listened with her ink-stained hands wrapped around her own cup and her eyes going wet and angry at the same time. 44 years, Opal said when Sadie finished. "I knew a piece of it. Everybody my age knew a piece, and none of us knew the whole. My own father brought a picture home once, of his mother, my grandmother, the only one we ever had of her. And when I asked where it came from, he said, 'The Pruitt woman made it, and don't tell the priest.'" Opal wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, rough. "We got our one photograph of my grandmother from a woman we let our children call a witch. She stood a photograph of my dead grandmother on our mantle and hid where it came from because the whole town had decided that hill was cursed." She looked at Sadie. "Why do you think there's a camera shop in a town this size that still does film? Half my regulars, the old ones, they've got a Pruitt print somewhere in the house they can't explain and won't throw out. I've been developing this town's grief for 30 years, and I never once put it together that I was finishing the work she started." "Why did she hide it?" Sadie asked. "Why not let them thank her?" Opal was quiet a moment. "Because in 1949, a woman who took money for portraits needed a license. This town would have found a reason to deny her. And a woman who gave them away for free was suspect in a different way. And a woman who photographed the quarry immigrants and the poor farm children and the TB patients, the ones decent folks crossed the street from, that woman was going to get talked about no matter what she did. So she let them talk. She let them call her a witch. A witch can work in peace," Opal said. "A saint gets a committee. Easier to be a ghost. The word ghost sat between them, and then Opal said the thing that changed the shape of the days that came after. "You washed that window," she said. "Didn't you? I heard it from the Nagy boy. He saw a light up there 2 nights running and it wasn't red." And Sadie said she'd cleaned the black paint off half the tower window so the 4 last prints could dry in real light. And Opal set down her mug and looked at her for a long moment and said, "Then you'd best get ready. Because a light in that window that isn't red is going to bring people up that hill who haven't been able to make themselves come up it in 40 years. Opal was right. The light did the thing that no amount of knocking on doors could have. That very evening, Sadie heard a car laboring up the bad pavement and went out onto the porch expecting the building inspector, and instead an old sedan stopped at the broken gate and a woman got out, slow, silver-haired, leaning on a cane, in a good coat that had been good a long time ago. She stood at the gate and looked up at the window, where the light was on, and put her free hand over her mouth. "That light," she said, and her voice shook. "That's been dark for years. I drove past from my sister's and I saw it lit and I had to. I'm sorry. I had to come up." Sadie came down and helped her up the broken walk and sat her in the one good chair by the stove, and the woman looked around the ruined hall with tears running the lines of her face and a strange peace under them. "My husband came up here in 1973, the woman said. He was dying of the black lung from the quarry, and he wanted one picture for me that wasn't him coughing, one where he looked like himself. The Pruitt woman made it in an afternoon and wouldn't take a dime. It's on my wall. It's the only thing in my house I'd run into a fire for." She looked at Sadie. "I always meant to come up this hill and thank her. I never did. She was a ghost story to my grandchildren before I ever found the nerve." She caught Sadie's hand in both of hers, and her grip was stronger than it looked. "Don't let that window go dark again," she said. "Whatever you have to do, you keep it lit." They came up the hill in 1s and 2s over the next days. It turned out Larkin was full of people who had a thread running back up to that house if you pulled on it, and for 40 years nobody had pulled. A retired quarry foreman whose immigrant father's only photograph, the one they'd sent back to Hungary and gotten returned when the Old Countries branch of the family died out, had been made by Alma Pruitt in 1952. A woman in her 70s who'd grown up on the poor farm and had exactly one picture of herself as a child, made by the witch on the hill, and had spent her whole life ashamed to say where it came from. They had all carried their piece alone, half grateful and half ashamed, and now somebody had opened the door and lit the window, and one by one they came up to find out it was real. Sadie brought them in. She lit the studio and let them stand in the room where they or theirs had once been photographed. And she watched grown people come apart over the discovery that the woman they'd feared had loved them enough to make them permanent. She started something then, almost without deciding to. She took the flat boxes of prints down from the tower, the ones Alma had kept a copy of, and she began, with the ledger as her index, to match the kept prints to the living. When the quarry foreman came, she went to the rack marked 1952 and found the plate, and printed his father fresh, and put it in his hands, and the man, who had run a quarry for 30 years, and buried 2 wives, sat down on the studio floor and cried like the boy he'd been when his father shipped over. Word of that got around faster than any light. By the end of the week there was a casserole on Sadie's kitchen counter that she hadn't bought, and a cord of split firewood at the gate with no note, and a box of darkroom paper on the porch, unopened, still in the manufacturer's wrap, that could only have come from Opal. The house was waking up, and the town was waking up around it. And Cyrus, who had spent 2 years hiding in the carriage house, started leaving his door open at night so he could hear the voices in the big house and know he wasn't the only one awake. She should have known the good would draw the other kind, too. She didn't hear the car the afternoon it came, a long black SUV that had never carried anything heavier than a set of golf clubs, because she was up in the studio matching a plate to a name. She heard the door of it shut and came down, and the man coming up her walk was the man from the auction, the one in the good coat who'd turned around in his chair to look at her like she'd taken his seat. Up close he was handsome in an expensive, effortful way, silver at the temples, and he was looking up at the house with the expression of a man doing arithmetic. "Grant Merrick," he said, stopping at the foot of the porch steps and putting out a hand she didn't take. "You're the young lady who surprised us all on Thursday. I've been asking around about you." He smiled, and the smile was practiced and not entirely unkind, which was worse than if it had been. "I'll be honest with you, because I think you're a person who appreciates honesty. I deal in photographs, fine art photography, vintage prints, and lately more and more, what the market calls vernacular work. Anonymous American photography. Old glass, old faces." He let his eyes travel up to the tower window. "And word is you've got a great deal of it up there." Sadie stood very still. "Word gets around fast," she said. "It's a small town," Merrick said, "and the good news travels fastest of all." "Here's the good news, Miss Byrne. What's in that tower? If it's what I'm hearing, a complete 40-year archive by a single unrecognized regional photographer that has real value in the right rooms. Not to Larkin. Larkin doesn't know what it's got. But to a collector, to a gallery, to the right archive in New York or Chicago, an intact body of work like that, mid-century, working-class subjects, the immigrant labor, the sanatorium, that's exactly the kind of thing the market is hungry for right now." He named a number then, easy, like it was nothing. "I'll buy the lot. The plates, the prints, the ledger, the camera, all of it. And the house too if you want out from under it. $46,000, cash, this week." It was more money than Sadie had ever seen in one place. For one long second, the whole shape of an easier life opened in front of her. A real apartment, a real bed, a shop of her own with her name on the glass, everything Otis had lost and she'd never had. She let herself look at it, and then she asked the one question that mattered. "And what would you do with them?" she said. "The plates." Merrick spread his hands, and this was where it went wrong for him, because he answered honestly, thinking honesty was what would close her. "Print them," he said. "Curate them. A book maybe, an exhibition. There's a real appetite for anonymous vernacular portraiture right now, the mystery of it, faces with no names attached. That's actually the value," he said, warming to it. "Nameless is more valuable. Strange as that sounds. A named portrait of a Hungarian quarryman is a document. An unnamed one is art. The buyer projects onto it. So we'd strip the identifying material. Obviously, the ledger's more of a liability than an asset, and we'd present the images clean. As art. Strip the names," Sadie said. "Forthin'," the Merrick said, nodding, pleased she'd followed. "It's counterintuitive, I know." And Sadie understood him then, all the way down. She understood that Alma Pruitt had spent 44 years making sure that a quarryman was a man named Lajos, who had a wife named Piroska and a daughter he never got to send the pictures to, that a sanatorium patient was a person with a date and a fear and a face, that no one who climbed this hill went unseen. And she understood that this man in the good coat wanted to buy all of it and do the one thing Alma had spent her life fighting, which was to erase every single person back into an anonymous, marketable nobody, to unsee 3,000 people, so that strangers could project a prettier story onto. He didn't want to steal Alma's work. He wanted to steal her whole life's meaning and sell the corpse. "No," Sadie said. Merrick blinked. People did not say no to him often. She could see that on him. "I don't think you understand the position you're in," he said, and the warmth in his voice went level and flat. "That house has open code violations going back a decade. The county has wanted it condemned since before you were born, and now that's your liability, not theirs. Those plates are silver-based. They're a fire hazard. They're deteriorating. There are people at the county health department who would love a reason to order that whole archive destroyed as a chemical hazard, and I know those people." He took a card from his coat and set it on the porch rail. "I can make all of that go away with one signature, and you walk away with $46,000 and a fresh start. Or I can let it run its course, and you can find out what it costs a girl with no money to fight a condemnation order and a health inspection at the same time." He looked up at the tower window one more time. "Think about it overnight," he said. "Don't think too long." He walked back down to his black SUV and drove away, and Sadie stood with the ledger, heavy in her hands, and looked at the white card on the rail and did not pick it up. Cyrus came and stood beside her in the doorway. "He going to make trouble?" the boy asked, and Sadie looked down at the town in the falling dark and said, "He's going to try." And Cyrus was quiet a moment and then said the longest string of words she'd yet heard from him. "She trusted us to keep the rain off," he said. "This is more rain." And Sadie put her hand on the boy's thin shoulder the first time she'd touched him, and he didn't flinch, and that was its own small landmark. The notice was taped to her gate the next morning. "County of Merrow," it said across the top, notice of unsafe structure, and below that a hearing date 11 days out, when the building inspector would recommend whether the house should be repaired on a timeline or condemned and the lot cleared. And clipped to it, a second sheet, from the county health department, a notice of pending inspection regarding the storage of hazardous photographic materials. Sadie read them both twice. Then she folded them into her jacket beside the deed, because a person who owns nothing learns to keep all her papers in one place, and she went back inside to the tower, because the answer to everything she had ever faced had turned out to be in a sealed room somewhere, and she'd learned to go looking. Alma had left more than plates and a ledger. Sadie had felt it the first night, a person that careful, that deliberate, that good at hiding a thing in plain sight for 40 years, does not leave the ending to chance. So she searched the tower properly, the way Otis had taught her to search a thing, with her hands and not her eyes. And under the writing desk, in a drawer with a false bottom, she found only because the outside was 2 inches deeper than the inside. She found the papers. A folder, cracked with age, tied with string, and inside it, the whole architecture of a woman who had thought 40 years ahead. There was a deed of gift, drawn up by a lawyer in the Contisi seat and notarized in 1981, transferring the entire photographic archive, every plate, every print, every negative Alma Pruitt had made or would make, out of her personal ownership and into an irrevocable charitable trust. The trust's single purpose, spelled out in a paragraph Alma had clearly dictated herself because it did not sound like a lawyer, was to hold the images in perpetuity, to make the portrait of any person freely available to that person or their descendants forever, and never under any circumstance to sell, disperse, or separate an image from the name and record of the person in it. There was a covenant filed against the house itself, a deed restriction running with the land, that any owner must permit reasonable access to the archive by the families of the people in it. And there was a letter. Sadie read the letter sitting in the dark chair with the red light on, and she read it 3 times. If you're reading this, the house found you, and I'm sorry and I'm glad in about equal measure, because I know now what it weighs, and I'm handing it to you. There's no money here. I never took a dime for a single picture, and I'd have made a poor businesswoman if I'd tried. What's here is better than money, and it's harder to keep. It's every face this town decided didn't count. The men who cut the stone and got cut down, the children nobody claimed, the ones who came up my hill in the dark because I was the only one who'd point a camera at them like they mattered. They mattered. Everyone. I have the proof of it in silver and glass, and I've fixed it so nobody can ever sell them off or scrub their names away and turn my people into decoration for a stranger's wall. The law's on my side now. I made sure of that in 1981 when I was younger than you likely are, because I always knew somebody would come along someday who saw dollars in that tower instead of souls. Don't let them. Keep making the pictures if you can. And if you can't, at least keep the names. A face without a name is a thing a stranger can own. A face with a name is a person, and a person belongs to nobody but themselves. Keep the light on up here. That's all. No one goes unseen. Sadie folded the letter along its old crease, careful as the keepsake it was, and she sat a long time with it in the red light while the tower held the cold. Alma Pruitt had beaten Grant Merrick in 1981, 12 years before Merrick was likely even in the business, 40 years before he'd ever driven his black SUV up the hill. The archive was not Sadie's to sell, which meant it was not Sadie's to lose either. It belonged by a document filed in the county courthouse decades ago to the 3,041 people whose faces were in it. All Sadie had to do was be brave enough to say so out loud. In a room full of the people who'd spent 40 years being too ashamed to climb the hill. She was still going through the folder near the bottom, when she found the one that stopped her cold. It was a print, not a plate, an 8x10 kept loose in the folder rather than filed, as if Alma had set it aside on purpose, and clipped to it was a page torn from an earlier, older ledger, a page from before the scene, from the very first years. The print was a portrait of a quarryman, a big, in his 40s, in his work clothes, the limestone dust still white in the creases of his hands, and Alma had photographed him the way she photographed all of them, with a dignity that made him look like a senator instead of a laborer. On the back, in the oldest, firmest version of her hand, was a name, Lestian, Carl Lestian, a date, the autumn of 1951, and a line, killed in the north, cut 3 weeks after. Widow could not pay for a stone, so I gave her the only thing I had that would last. Made 2 prints. She took both. I kept the plate, and on the torn ledger page clipped behind it, a longer entry, because Alma had known even then that some records need explaining. Carl Lestian came up the hill on a Sunday, because his wife shamed him into it, said if he was going to spend his life in that death hole of a quarry, she wanted a picture of him whole and breathing to show their boy someday. He was gone by the end of the month. A slab came down in the north cut. His widow, Anna, left Larkin the next spring and I lost track of her. But the boy was born that summer, after. And she named him for nobody, took her maiden name back, wanted the child to have no part of a town that let her husband die for a courthouse floor in some city he'd never see. I heard, years on, that boy did well for himself. Left Indiana, made money. I hope he did. I hope somebody told him his father was a man worth a photograph, because his mother never would. She was too busy trying to outrun the shame of where he came from. If ever the day arrives that somebody needs to give this picture back to that family, it's here. His father was somebody. He deserves to know it. Sadie read the name on the back of the print again. Lestian. And she thought about a man in a good coat, standing at the bottom of her porch steps, telling her he dealt in anonymous faces. That nameless was worth more than named. That the trick of to strip a person down to something a stranger could own. She thought about a man who had left Indiana and made money and built a whole life out of turning named people into anonymous art. A man who could not have said a let if you'd asked him where his own grandfather was buried or what the man had done for a living. Because his family had spent 2 generations running from the answer. And she looked at the dignified, dust-handed portrait of Carl Lestian, killed in the North Cut in 1951, and she understood that the one thing in the world that could stop Grant Merrick from erasing 3,000 names was the discovery that his own name was one of the ones that had been erased. The hearing was 9 days out, and the man who wanted to strip the names off Alma Pruitt's people and burn her ledger for the market's convenience was the grandson of the first man she ever gave a photograph to for free. The only proof of it in the world was sitting in Sadie Byrne's 2 hands. If you're still with me, if you're still up on this hill in the cold with Sadie and this photograph, do me a favor and hit subscribe and tell me in the comments. Has anyone ever handed you back a piece of your own family you didn't know was missing? Because what Sadie decides to do with what she's holding is the whole heart of this story. And I've been waiting to tell you. Now let's go back to the hill. For 2 days, Sadie carried the photograph and the ledger page everywhere, folded in her jacket beside the deed and the county notice, and she thought about what it was. It was a weapon. She understood that much the way she understood to chisel, was a tool, and could also open a skull. Grant Merrick wanted to unsee 3,000 people, and she was holding the one thing that would make him understand in his own body what it costs to be unseen. She could walk into whatever office he worked out of and lay the portrait of his grandfather on his desk and watch him understand that she could tell the whole trade. All those rooms in New York and Chicago, that the tastemaker of anonymous vernacular Americana was himself a Lestian, a quarryman's grandson, 3 generations off a limestone shack on the Larkin Road. She could make him stop. People had made her do things her whole life by holding up the one card she couldn't beat. She thought about it for 2 days, and then she decided she would rather lose the house than win it that way. Because the whole point of the thing in her hands, the whole point of Alma's 44 years, was that you don't use a person's face against them. You give it back. That was the line the ledger drew between what Alma did and what Merrick did, and if Sadie crossed it, she'd have won the house and lost the reason to keep it. So she made 2 decisions in the dark of the tower. She would fight the condemnation and the health order out in the open, with the trust and the deed in the town, and she would win it clean or lose it clean. And she would give Grant Merrick his grandfather's picture, not as a weapon, but because it was his, and it always had been, and Alma had written down 40 years ago that it should be returned if the day ever came. It wasn't Sadie's to spend. It never had been. She told Opal about the room and the boxes and the ledger, all of it except the part about Lestian, because that part wasn't hers to hand around a frame shop. And Opal started making phone calls, and over those days something began to move through Larkin that no one had planned. The silver-haired widow told her sister, and the sister told 2 more, and it turned out the town was full of people who had a thread back to that house, and Now that somebody had lit the window and opened the door, they came to find out it was real. They came up the hill in ones and twos. The retired foreman and the poor farm woman and a man whose mother had died in the sanatorium and left him one photograph, and a schoolteacher who'd quietly sent grieving families up that hill for years when they had nowhere else to turn for a picture of someone they were losing. They had all carried their piece alone, half ashamed, and now, one at a time, they set it down. Sadie brought them in and lit the studio and pulled their people's plates and printed them fresh, and she watched grown men and women come apart over a photograph of which had made them 50 years ago. By the second evening, there was so much firewood at the gate she and Cyrus couldn't stack it fast enough, and a check folded under the studio lamp with no name on it, and the diner downtown started sending up the last pie of the night no charge, because the owner's grandmother had been a Pruitt subject in the 50s, and he'd never told a soul either. The house was coming back, grain by grain, and the town was coming back around it. And Cyrus, who 11 days before had held a hatchet at his side in a doorway, now opened the door to the people who came and took their coats and stood at the edge of the room, watching them weep, and something in his own shoulders came down half an inch every time. The night before the hearing, Sadie couldn't make her hands hold still. She'd faced down plenty of things alone, caseworkers and group homes and the cold, but she'd never once stood up in a room full of adults and asked them for anything, because asking and being told no was the one wound she'd taught herself to stop opening. Opal found her on the porch at dusk and sat down heavy on the step. "You don't have to be smooth," Opal said. "Merrick's smooth. That's his whole trick. You just have to tell them the truth and let them look at you while you do it. That's harder, but it's the only thing that's ever worked on a room. And if they vote to condemn it anyway, then they do it in front of every person who stood up for it. And this town has to carry that home and live with it. Either way," she said, "you make them look. Same as she did. You make them look." The hearing was on a Tuesday morning in a low county room with bad carpet and a long table at the front. Sadie got there early in her cleanest clothes, which were not clean enough, and sat in the front row with the ledger and the trust folder in a canvas bag on her lap, and Cyrus beside her in a borrowed coat of Opal's late husband's, sitting straight as he could make himself. Grant Merrick came in with the building inspector and the health officer and a lawyer in a good sit suit, and they sat at the front like the outcome was already arranged, which it likely was in their minds. Merrick gave Sadie a small nod, almost gentle. He thought he was about to do her a favor she was too young to understand. The inspector read the violations first, a long flat list. Failing porch, compromised roof, no certificate of occupancy, electrical and plumbing condemned years back. He recommended the structure be declared unsafe. Then the health officer read her piece about the volume of silver-based photograph material, the fire load, the chemical storage, and recommended the materials be removed and destroyed under supervision as a hazard. And then Merrick's lawyer stood, and Merrick himself stood a moment after, and he was good at this, easy and warm and reasonable, a man who'd closed 1,000 rooms. "Nobody here is the villain," Merrick said, spreading his hands. "That house is genuinely dangerous, and those materials genuinely are deteriorating. That's not in dispute. A young woman with no resources bought it sight unseen for $18, and she can't possibly bring it to code or store that archive safely, and I don't blame her for trying. I admire the spirit of it. But spirit doesn't rewire a house. My firm is prepared to settle the back taxes, cover the demolition or the repair, take custody of the archive under professional conservation, and pay this young woman a fair price on top, so she walks away with money in her pocket instead of a debt and a fire hazard she'll never climb out from under." He looked around the room. "That's not cruelty. That's the responsible thing. Sometimes the kind thing is to let a thing pass into hands that can care for it properly." Heads nodded. It sounded like sense. It sounded like the only grown-up end to a foolish girl's story. The chairman looked down the table at Sadie. "Miss Byrne," he said, "you're the owner of record. Do you have anything to say before we vote?" Her legs did not want to hold her, but they did. "I do," she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted, so she made it bigger, the way Opal had told her. "Mr. Merrick says I can't care for what's up there properly. He's right that I can't rewire the house alone, and he's right that I don't have money. But he's wrong about what's up there. And so is the health department, and so is every person in this town who spent 40 years calling that house haunted. Because none of you know what it is. I didn't either until 8 days ago. She lifted the ledger out of the bag and set it on the rail in front of her and opened it. This was sealed in a room nobody in this town knew existed. It's a record, 44 years of it, and she read. Not many, just a few. Carl Lestian, quarryman, killed in the North Cut, whose widow couldn't afford a stone, so she was given the only thing that would last. The boy of 6 who went home to God the following Tuesday, whose mother got 2 prints. The woman who came so her children would have a face to remember her by. She read them flat and plain, no performance, and the bad carpet room went very still. Alma Pruitt photographed this town's forgotten people for 44 years, Sadie said. The quarry men your courthouses were built on. The children off the poor farm. The sick from the sanatorium up the valley. The ones this town crossed the street from, she made them a photograph, the only one most of them ever owned, and she never took a cent, and she never asked for credit, and she never got any. You saw a red light in her window and decided she was a witch. Because it was easier than climbing the hill to find out an old woman was up there, making sure your neighbors got to exist somewhere on paper. She closed the book. There's 3,041 names in here, she said. That's more people than live in Larkin now. You can vote to condemn that house and let the health department burn what's inside. But you should know exactly whose faces you're burning before you raise your hands. For a moment, nobody moved. Then in the back, the silver-haired widow stood up, leaning on her cane. My husband is in that tower, she said, and her voice rang clear off the bad carpet. 1973. The only picture I have of him not sick. If you burn that, you burn the last of him. And I am 90 years old, and I will not let you. And then the retired quarry foreman stood. My father, 1952. Sent home to Hungary and came back to me when they all died over there. She's the only reason I know my own father's face. And then the poor farm woman stood and said, 1958, me, aged 7. The only picture that proves I was ever a child, and I've been ashamed of where it came from my whole life, and I am done being ashamed. She sat down hard. One after another, all over the room, people stood and said a year and a name out loud. The years ran back more than 40 of them, and the bad Carpet County room filled up with the sound of a town saying plainly, at last, the thing it had only ever whispered. Grant Merrick turned in his chair and watched a room full of people he'd planned to sell as anonymous art get to their feet and claim their own faces by name, one by one, and the smooth went out of him, degree by degree, like heat leaving a room. And then Sadie did the thing she'd decided to do. She reached into her bag and took out, not the trust folder, not yet, but a single print, and she stepped around the rail and walked to the front table and set it down in front of Grant Merrick, face up, and stepped back. He looked down at it the way you look at a thing handed to you by mistake. A quarryman in his 40s, limestone white in the creases of his hands, photographed with the dignity of a senator. I want you to know, Sadie said quietly. So most of the room couldn't hear that I thought about using this. For 2 days I carried it, and I thought about walking into your office with it. But it isn't a weapon. It's yours, Carl Lestian. Killed in the North Cut in 1951, 3 weeks after this was made. His widow took both prints and left this town and named her son after nobody, so he'd never have to know where he came from. She kept the plate, Alma did. She wrote it down 40 years ago, that if the day ever came, somebody should give it back to the family. She turned the print over so he could read the back, the name and the date and the line. This is your grandfather, Mr. Merrick, that's where you come from. A limestone shack on the Larkin Road and a man who was worth a photograph, even though nobody in your family would ever say so. Grant Merrick, who dealt in anonymous faces, who had built a whole life and a whole fortune on the principle that a person is worth more once you strip their name away, sat in a county hearing room and read a dead woman's handwriting about his own grandfather, and his face came apart. It came apart the way a wall comes apart, slow and then all at once. There was a year, he said, and the words came out of him wrong, too fast and then too slow. My mother would never talk about her father. My grandfather. She said he was nobody, a laborer, that we came from nothing, and the point of a life was to become something. He stopped. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth. I built a whole business out of the idea that a face without a name is worth more than one with a name. He looked at the print like it might dissolve, And she photographed him, he said. Somebody photographed him like he was worth it. Like he wasn't nobody. Somebody did, Sadie said. In the house you came here to help them tear down. The chairman called a recess because the room had stopped being a hearing and become something else. And in the hallway, while the town buzzed behind the door, Sadie found Merrick standing alone by a window with the print in his hands. And she did the last thing. She took out the trust folder and laid it on the sill beside him. You should see this too, she said, before you decide anything. And she showed him the deed of gift from 1981, the irrevocable trust, the covenant filed against the house. It's not mine to sell, she said. It never was. Alma gave the whole archive away 40 years ago into a trust that says the pictures belong to the people in them forever and can never be separated from their names. You couldn't have bought it if I'd said yes. She beat you before you were born, Mr. Merrick. She knew somebody like you would come. No offense. He almost laughed, a wrecked sound. She knew, he said, turning the pages. She knew somebody would try to do exactly what she stopped himself. What I do for a living, he said. He looked at the deed a long time. Then he looked at the print of his grandfather. Then he looked up at Sadie. And there was something almost frightening in his face, a big, successful man undone by 8 lines of an old woman's handwriting. Why did you give me this, he said. You could have buried me with it. An hour ago, I was going to have your house condemned and your archive burned. Because it's true whether I stay angry at you or not, Sadie said. And because somebody once taught me that a thing isn't ruined just because it's been left. Not a house, not a room full of people. Not a year of your grandmother's life she spent too ashamed to talk about. Or a grandfather you were raised to think was nobody. She nodded at the print in his hands. That's he always was. I just held on to it for you a while. When the recess ended, Grant Merrick stood up before the vote, and in front of the whole room, he withdrew his firm's interest in the property. He told the chairman that the archive was legally protected under an irrevocable trust that predated any of them, that his professional opinion, for whatever it was worth, was that it was a body of work of real historical significance that belonged exactly where it was, with the community that made it, and that he would focus the cost of a Clancy stored safely, and no one would have to burn a thing. So the plates could be stored safely, and no one would quite. He asked that the county grant the owner a repair timeline, rather than a condemnation. He did not ask for his name on anything. The building inspector, looking at a room full of witnesses and a developer who'd just reversed his whole position, recommended a year to bring the structure to code. It passed. Nobody in that room was going to vote against a house they'd just stood up for by name. The back taxes came to a little over $4,000. 9 years of a house nobody had wanted. Grant Merrick paid them the next morning, person, at the same county window where Sadie had counted out her $18 in ones and a 5, and he didn't ask for his name on a single piece of paper. As for Alma's own money, the tower held exactly what her letter had promised, which was almost nothing. A cigar box with $40 in it, marked for chemistry, and a jar of coins worn smooth from handling, and a house and a ledger with 3,041 names in it, and not 1 cent beyond that. It had never been about money. It had only ever been about the light. That night, Grant Merrick came back up the hill. He came alone in old clothes, not the good coat, and he stood at the broken gate a long time before he came up the walk. Sadie let him in. She didn't have power yet, but she had the stove throwing real heat, and candles, and up in the tower the window glowed warm and white over the town for anyone who cared to look. Can I see it, he said, the room, and she took him up. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the walls of plates, and the dead safe light, and the black painted window with the top half washed clean, and she pulled the rack marked 1951 and found the plate and let him hold it up to the candle. The grandfather he'd never known, in glass, in his own 2 hands. He sat down on the floor of that round room among 44 years of saved faces, an expensive man in the dark, and he did not get up for a long while, and Sadie left him there, because some rooms a person needs to be alone in. When he came down, he sat across the stove from her and Cyrus, and for a man who dealt in words for a living, he had a hard time finding any. I want to help, he said finally. Not buy it, not put my name on it. Help, I know conservators. I know how to store glass plates, so they last another 100 years. I know how to make a proper archive out of what's up there. And I know people who'd fund it quietly, for the right reasons. He looked around the ruined front room. "Tell me what it's supposed to be," he said. "Not what it was. What you want it to be." Sadie had been turning that over for a week without saying it out loud, and now it came easy. "A place where the people this town forgets get to be seen," she said. She still does it. "Alma, through me now, I guess. Anybody in Larkin who wants one true photograph of themselves, or somebody they're losing and can't afford a studio, and would never set foot in one anyway, they come up the hill, same as they did for 44 years. And I make it, and I give it to them, and I write their name in the book. And the pictures already in the tower go back to their families, free, every one I can match." She looked at him. "I want to keep the light on. That's the only rule. Whatever else, the light stays on, and nobody's name comes off anything, ever." Merrick nodded slowly, like she'd handed him a document he could finally read. "Then that's what we'll build," he said. But it was Opal who made it real. She came up the hill 2 days later with a folder under her arm and set it on the kitchen table. "You can't run an archive and a free portrait studio out of your back pocket at 21, she said. "Not legal, not safe, not for long. So here's what we do. We fold it into the trust Alma already made. We put a board on it, grown people who answer for it, my name and Merrick's conservator and that school teacher and the widow's granddaughter who does the books at the bank. You run it, you make the pictures and keep the names. But you don't carry it alone, because that's the one mistake she made." Opal's voice caught. "Alma carried this hill by herself for 44 years, she said, and this town let her, and it near buried her up here in the dark. We are not doing that to you." So they made it real. The conservator, Merrick, came in the spring and built proper cold storage in the tower and taught Sadie how to house the plates, so they'd outlive everyone alive. The trust took the studio in under its wing, and the house came back over the next year, and it took the whole town. Merrick's money paid for a roof and honest wiring, but people who weren't on anybody's payroll worked alongside the crews, and that was the part that mattered. The retired foreman turned out to know stonework and rebuilt the porch steps out of quarry limestone, the same stone his father had cut, and wouldn't take gas money. A retired electrician spent his Saturdays running new circuits. Opal emptied half her back room up the hill, mat board and frames and a proper drum easel, all of it, at the price of nothing. Sadie did the glass herself, relighted every stained glass transom in the house, with Otis's tools in her own 2 hands, and reglazed the tall north studio window so clean that the light came through it in the morning like something poured. She washed the black paint off the tower window last of all. She'd left it half done all winter, the top clear and the bottom still black, but on the first warm day of spring she carried a scraper up and took the rest of it off, and stood in the round room in real daylight for the first time, and understood that Alma had never once seen this room in the sun. 44 years in the red dark, so the town could keep its ghost. Sadie put clear glass in where a cracked pane had been, and that night she left a lamp burning in it, a warm white lamp, and she left it burning every night after. The town below had spent 40 years crossing the street from a red light they'd called a witch. Now there was a warm one at the top of the hill, and slowly, then all at once, they got used to looking up at it instead of away. They came on a Sunday in June, the ones who could, and the ones whose people were only pictures now. Opal and the schoolteacher had spent 3 months working from the ledger, tracking the families down, following names across 40 years and a dozen states, calling old numbers and writing letters. Not everyone was living. Some couldn't travel. But more than 80 of them came back up the hill that Sunday, the descendants of the quarrymen and the poor farm children and the sanatorium, dead, and Sadie had taken the flat boxes of kept prints down from the tower and laid them out on tables in the studio. Everyone, and she gave them back. People found their own grandmothers, their own fathers, held them and wept and held strangers, who'd had a great uncle in the same quarry collapse. A man in his 60s showed his daughter a portrait of a limestone worker and said, "That's who I'm named for. And I always thought he was nobody, and here he is looking like a king." Grant Merrick came, in old clothes, and stood off to the side a long time with his grandfather's print. And then he did a thing Sadie hadn't expected. He cleared his throat in that loud room and told them all who he was, a Lestian, a quarryman's grandson, and that he'd spent his whole life and built his whole fortune out of being ashamed of a man who'd turned out to be worth a photograph, and that he was done being ashamed, and that, if anybody in the room ever had a face they needed cared for, they should call him, because he finally understood what the work was for. He said it so that nobody else would ever have to be ashamed of where they came from again. There were reunions in that house all afternoon that Sadie would carry the rest of her life. Two old women who'd been children on the poor farm the same year, who'd lost track of each other for 60 years, found each other across the studio over their own photographs, and held on a long time. A family stood a print of a grandmother nobody living had ever met on the mantel where it belonged. They ate in the big kitchen that had been built to feed a crowd, and for the first time in 9 years it fed one, and Sadie stood in the studio doorway at one point and looked at the room full of people who had every one of them once been somebody this town threw away, and who had grown up and grown old and climbed a hill then. They'd spent their self afraid of to come home to the one place that had ever looked at them like they mattered. She thought Alma should have lived to see it. Then she thought that maybe, in the only way that counted, she finally had. Nobody renamed the house. Somebody suggested a plaque and Sadie said no. It was the Pruitt House. It had always been the Pruitt House, and it would stay the Pruitt House, and the woman it was named for had never wanted a single word of credit while she was alive, so she wasn't going to get a brat sign now that she was gone. The only thing that changed was the window. It stayed lit. Cyrus stayed too. He turned 20 that summer, and somewhere in the year of the work he'd stopped being the boy who kept the rain off and become the man who ran the darkroom. Because it turned out Sadie could teach the way Otis had taught her, slow and by the hands. And Cyrus had the patience for it, the stillness, the willingness to stand in the dark and wait for a face to decide it was ready. She'd catch him up in the tower some nights, alone, working a print, and she'd stand in the doorway in the red light and watch him ease a portrait up out of the tray, with the exact care she'd once watched Otis use, and she'd think about how a thing gets passed down. Not through blood, through hands. Through somebody older handing somebody younger a tool and the belief they could use it. The first new one came in October, almost a year to the day after Sadie had. Though she didn't come for a bed, she came for a picture. A woman from the meat-packing plant that had opened out by the highway, an immigrant like the quarrymen before her, with a little English, and a phone full of pictures of her kids, but not one of herself, not one she'd ever been the subject of, instead of the one holding the camera. Somebody at the plant had told her. There was a place up the hill where a young woman made you a real photograph for nothing, and would write your name in a book, so you'd always have existed there. She stood at the broken gate, which Sadie had left broken on purpose, because every one of them stood at that gate first. "Is this the witch house?" the woman asked, in careful English, half a question. "That's what they used to call it," Sadie said. "Come up." And she brought her into the north-lit studio, and sat her on the platform in the good light, and made her a portrait the way Alma had made 3,000 of them, with all the dignity in the world, and printed it, and put it in her hands, and then opened the ledger to the last written page, and picked up the pen. She hadn't written her own name in it yet. She'd written 100 other names in that book over the year, matched the old prints, and logged the new ones, and never once put herself in it. She thought about it now, and then she wrote the woman's name and the date, and under it, because it was time, she wrote her own. Sadie Byrne, keeper, and then the year. She looked at her own line in the book, above and below it 3,041 names of people Larkin had thrown away and one woman had gathered up, and something in her chest came down half an inch. She'd spent her whole life believing that being seen was a thing other people got and kept from her, that she was the one holding the camera, the one behind the folder, the one whose face nobody made permanent. It had taken a dead man's tools and a dead woman's ledger, and an $18 house to teach her otherwise. Being seen isn't something somebody grants you, she thought, and wrote her name a little firmer for thinking it. It's something you can decide to give, and once you're the one giving it, no one can take it back from you. That night she walked the house before bed, the way she did now, checking the doors, banking the stove, Cyrus already asleep over a book in the front room. She climbed to the tower last and stood at the window where Alma had sat alone in the red dark for 44 years, so the town could keep its ghost. The black paint was gone, the glass was clear. Below her, Larkin lay scattered in its own small lights, And up here one more light burned where the whole town could see it, warm and white and unafraid. She thought of all the threads running down that hill into all those houses, all the people down there who had a faces in a frame they couldn't quite explain and wouldn't throw out, all the ones still to come up the gate in the dark wanting proof they'd been here. She trimmed the lamp and left it burning, the way she did every night, the way she would keep doing every night for a long time to come. Nobody had ever left Sadie Byrne anything but a folder and a price. She spent the rest of her life making sure that was never the last thing anyone got from this hill. No one goes unseen, not if she could help it, not on this hill.